The head of the Jordanian Air Force was clear when he said, "We will wipe them off the face of the earth." Jordan has stepped up its fight against Islamic State last week in response to the brutal killing of a captured Jordanian pilot. Well, joining us now to discuss Jordan's role in the international fight against ISIS is Besma Momani, political scientist at the University of Waterloo and the Balsillie School of International Affairs. She's also a senior fellow at CG. Welcome back.
Thank you.
Last week, brutal week in Jordan. Just remind our viewers, the video came out last week. We'll talk about perhaps when the lieutenant was actually killed. But who was this lieutenant who was killed?
Well, Muaz Kasasbeh is he's a young man with a new family. That all resonated with a Jordanian population that saw one of their own. And he comes from a southern family that's quite large, predominantly. So there's a lot of, I think, political power or political pressure that comes with him. And he plays a very important role today in, I think, the national narrative about what Jordan has to play in this fight against ISIS.
Is he, was he, I should say, I mean, an ordinary military guy? You say he comes from, a certain kind of family. Just put that in the context of what he represented.
Well, it's a poor family. I mean, let's keep in mind, this is where a lot of poor young men in Jordan find their mark is to go into the military, and clearly being a fighter pilot is a very important position, primarily because it requires that one be trusted, that they have to be from a loyal, quote-unquote, family, and that not necessarily is a given in Jordan. So this is something that I think really represented a Jordanian, kind of from, a poor southern family. The town he's from, Karak, is not well-developed. It's not the metropolis that Amman represents in terms of cosmopolitan and urbanite. It is, again, a conservative, small town in the south that makes a lot of noise. It has historically been a place of protest against the government and the monarchy. So when this particular man was killed, this pilot, it really resonated throughout the country.
Okay, so he comes from a place that you say people have a history of protesting against the Jordanian government. So last Tuesday, this horrific video comes out, shocks the world, shocks Jordan. What's the Jordanian public's response to all this?
Well, it's really interesting. I mean, you definitely have in the first days of the killing, or at least seeing the killing, an enormous amount of patriotism and nationalism, this unified voice. But I think that's kind of the mirage. Underneath that, there is a lot of skepticism. In the same town that Kasasbeh comes from, for example, there was a former pilot that actually defected and joined ISIS. There's a strong sort of pro-ISIS contingency there that one can't forget. So that's, I think, often forgotten, and partly it's because they view that Jordan's fight shouldn't be with ISIS. There's a great sort of pacifist tone there, primarily because they say, well, the Jordanian government should be focusing on the home front, focusing on the domestic economy, not sort of fitting the quote-unquote Western bill and fighting a Western, war against ISIS. They should be focusing on the home front. So there's still, an anti-interventionist tone that often will come back to the surface once all of this mourning period goes, is forgotten.
And yet, as we said off the top, I mean, the head of the Air Force says, we're going after ISIS. King Abdullah came out quite strongly. What's been the response among the officialdom of Jordan?
This resonates greatly for the king and for the monarchy and the government. It looks like Jordan's got its act together, that it's going after ISIS, that it's playing a lead role. But behind that, I mean, the reality is 90% of the airstrikes are still American-led. Jordan has, yes, a small air force, a lot of F-16s that are useful in this particular battle, but, B-1 bombers are what are needed to really combat ISIS, and only the Americans have that. So, beyond the headlines and all the rhetoric, the truth is the Jordanians aren't really a lead player in the fight against ISIS, but it's a symbolic value.
But does it look good to the kingdom's people what the king is doing? Prior to the execution of the lieutenant, there was talk of a prisoner swap between Jordan and Islamic State. Put that into the bigger picture for us.
I mean, that was necessary, and I think that initially there was criticism that hopefully the king doesn't pander to these southern tribes, but he really needed to do that, because I think if you understand Jordanian politics, the south could really just basically inflame in reaction to the captured pilot. So it had to appear to do everything and anything possible. And I think it was genuine in wanting to and willing to swipe out this Iraqi prisoner in exchange for Qassasbid. But the reality is, I think Jordanian intelligence, which is very good, knew that the pilot was dead. Didn't know how, didn't have the graphic video, but knew that it was too late. And that's why they asked for the proof of life. And,
right.
and they were, in essence, I think, proved right in making sure that was verified, which it was not, obviously.
Okay, I want to read something. This comes from Lena Khatib, who's the director of the Carnegie Middle East Center. And she was talking about Jordan's executions of the jihadists and how it could backfire. Just a short quote here. Here's what she said. Neither of the jihadists executed by Jordan are connected with ISIS in its current incarnation, but with Al-Qaeda. Through their execution, therefore, Jordan has inadvertently strengthened the link between ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Do you agree with that, Basma?
Not really, only because I think Al-Qaeda as a real force at least in the Levant, is really Al-Nusra Front in Syria. And so it's really, I think, morphed and changed from the Al-Qaeda of 2000. Al-Qaeda of 2000 became ISIS, and Iraq became ISIS. So, I think it's understanding the development of where Al-Qaeda has gone. The Al-Qaeda of 2000 is no more. It's a very different beast.
So trying to pull these apart, there's IS on one side, or ISIS, whatever you want to call it, and Al-Qaeda on the other, and trying to understand that those lines, those demarcations are gone.
No, and in fact, ISIS and Al-Qaeda fight each other today. I mean, Al-Nusra Front is fighting ISIS in Syria. So in fact, trying to find unity among these organizations it's not there, at least in the Levant. It just isn't. Okay,
I want to talk about a little bit more about Jordan's support for the coalition in these last few days since that video has come out. Currently opposing IS, King Abdullah says, yep, we're in this. What are you seeing in that? Is that going to stick?
I think Jordanian public opinion is fickle, and I think that the monarchy and the government shouldn't assume that this hurrah of nationalism is going to stay. At the moment, people are united, without a doubt. There is this feeling of wanting vengeance, going after ISIS in full force. And just today, the skies are filled with F-16s flying over much of Amman, and Jordanians love that. This is a way that they feel as though there's some retribution for this loss. But I do feel that there is still this really strong pacifist undertone. People are frustrated with the economy. They want jobs. They want bread on the table. Prices have gone up so dramatically in Jordan in the past 4 or 5 years. And there's an influx of Syrian refugees. That's where they see the real dynamic or problem in the Middle East. It's the Assad regime pushing out these millions of people into their country. In the northern part of Jordan, almost 50% of the population now are of Syrian descent, or of Syrians coming from the south. That's the visible reminder of the geopolitical problems of the region. ISIS seems so far away to most Jordanians, so they really are demanding more about a resolution on the Syria front and less about ISIS. I think that's going to come back.
Well, this is, all these things are always connected. So as 4 years of Syrians, coming across the border, no chance of going home anytime soon, tens of thousands of them flooding in all the time. What has been the impact on Jordan, a country that already has so many refugees and Palestinians, 70%, perhaps as high as that, of Palestinian origin? What's the toll that this is taking on Jordan?
It's taken an enormous toll. I think people don't realize, and I've been to Jordan several times just last year, and the unemployment rate has skyrocketed. Rental prices have gone up dramatically. Things like water, infrastructure, electricity has become increasingly in short supply. Schools are overburdened. I mean, they're trying to take in Syrian refugees. So you can imagine a country that's already developing, already relatively poor, and now you have the influx of all of these, almost a quarter of its population. That's an enormous burden to take on. The traffic in the country is just ridiculous because of the number of cars. That's not to take into account the fact that you have on the border in Zatari, the refugee camp, hundreds of thousands of people in squalor, with no real future, as you said, to return. When will they make their way into the cities? And that's really going to be an enormous problem domestically for Jordan, and they're not really getting the kind of international support that they really need.
So as the F-16s are flying overhead, is that the king's way of sort of distracting his population from what you just suggested are the real problems that Jordan is facing?
Well, reverting to nationalism is also always in every country, a cheap ploy.
It's good propaganda.
It's great national propaganda. I mean, why wouldn't you take advantage of it? You have the country united. You have this country, as you noted, has influx of refugees from everywhere, finally united around a cause. You take advantage of it. I think that's as a political scientist, I can see why that would be the case. But to sort of sort of mistaken the reality that there's still this great pacifist undertone and this feeling of, okay, we've diverted our attention away from fighting the Assad regime and looking at the real problem of the Syrian influx to now focusing on this faraway problem of ISIS. I think that message or that mood is going to come back.
Well, let me bring in, the opponent in here, which is ISIS. Great propaganda from their perspective, beheadings and immolations. We know that. They also do it to, send a warning. Hey, don't send your military, and your citizens will be at risk. What can Jordanians take away from it? You say they're pacifists by nature, or at least by practice. And now the message is, hey, you've come onto our territory. You're in this fight. Be careful. You're in trouble.
Absolutely, and you can just take a look at example of the United Arab Emirates, which actually, the day that Qasasbeh was downed, actually withdrew. It stopped being active in the sorties against ISIS for this fear, the fear that, oh no, if one of our pilots get downed, we're going to be in the situation that Jordan might be in. Yes, Jordan has really stepped into this, and it's going to be very difficult to step out. If we're talking about a war that's going to take years by most, U.S. intelligence estimates, that's an enormous involvement for the Jordanians. And I think that if this happens again, and the chances it will, that you'll have another downed pilot, we're going to start to see, I think, a reversion to that pacifist argument.
They'll say we've got to get out of this coalition.
And this is not our, I think there's still an argument in Jordan that this is not our fight. And I understand the Western community may not see that, but from the perspective of a poor developing country that says, why are we diverting our money, resources, and time to fighting a Western problem, in their opinion, or an Iraqi-Syrian problem, when the real problem we see, again, is the influx of hundreds and thousands and millions of Syrians.
I want to pick up on something you said right at the beginning of our population and where this lieutenant was from in the south. And you said, there are already rifts there. So I want to just talk a little bit about, Jordan's contribution to the fight against Islamic State. I don't ever know what to call it, ISIL, ISIS. Has it strengthened or drawn on the rifts that already, predated all of this?
At the moment, it's actually eliminated the rifts because, again, that particular town, Karak, is actually very much against Jordanian intervention. But now with one of their own kind of downed, it's become a rallying around the flag, and we start to see more, I think, support for the government's effort. But that is, I think, again, a temporary blip. I think the reality is the southern towns are going to be very critical of the government moving forward. I think the government has to be very careful about not taking advantage of this nationalistic sentiment and overdoing it or overstepping it. I think show of force is wanted now, but in the long run, people are going to say, wait a minute, what's in this for us? This is not putting food on the table. This is not solving our really high unemployment problem. And again, I think that kind of focusing on the domestic front is going to come back.
And if you're the king, he's, I think by a lot of estimates, done pretty well over the last few years as the rest of the Middle East kind of explodes and implodes around Jordan. It's surrounded by, Israel, West Bank, it's Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, Saudi, all countries that are going through their own internal crisis and the external. Put Jordan in the context of that, in the fight against ISIS and the larger geopolitical moves going on in the Middle East. Where's Jordan fitting in right now?
Well, one thing to go back a little bit, Jordan it had an Arab Spring. It didn't necessarily escape the Arab Spring. There were calls for reform. There were calls for the kind of political liberalization. And that's still, I think, a very strong undercurrent remaining. In the larger context of how it fits geopolitically, Jordan always played not necessarily a really strong muscle role. It doesn't have the population. It doesn't have a very big army. It has excellent security services in the sense of intelligence. It's always been the number one in terms of intelligence. And that's why it's been doing so well in preventing internal problems from, I think, expanding, because it does a great job of tampering that sort of early diagnosis and fixing the problem. It has a soft hand. The security service or intelligence service there is notorious for, using honey as opposed to vinegar to sort of calm a problem. And that works well, and that's sort of the style that was inherited from the old king. But that's still the reality of Jordan being a small country. It doesn't have a big military role. It's always been symbolic. And this is a great purpose of Jordan, is to be a symbolic, moderate is often the word used, pro-Western regime, and that is useful for both the West and increasingly for a number of Arab governments that are trying to say there's an alternative voice out there to to all of this, I think, view that the entire Middle East is just in flames. In fact, Jordan is that moderate voice, and if we can support a country like that, the region can have
success.
So
it's playing well into its coordination with the Americans, a longtime ally. Jordan's doing well on that front, and you see that sort of continuing as a good way forward.
Oh, absolutely. And in fact, the day of Qasasbeh's, the horrific video was released, the king was in Jordan, and the king got an enormous amount of commitments from the U.S. Congress. It increased its military aid to Jordan, increased its foreign aid. So it really, I think, it highlights the symbolic value that Jordan plays in the region.
Let me end our conversation by asking this, which is the Syrian refugee problem is the biggest. You talked about Zaatari refugee camp. The biggest problem that Jordan has been facing over the last 4 years as the civil war in Syria continues on. What's it supposed to do about that crisis right now?
It's a great toll because Jordan does not have the capacity. I mean, Jordan is a country of 6 million and Syria is a country of 22 million. So there's very little that a small country like Jordan can do on the Syrian file. I think what it's done so far is a good thing, keeping its borders open, although I'm critical of the fact that they've closed their border intermittently. It always has to play an important role in welcoming those Syrian refugees who are fleeing for their lives. But there is a grave, grave challenge here that if these refugees don't return, how is Jordan going to survive, particularly, again, infrastructure? It needs infrastructural support. You need to have the water pipes, a very physical, sort of capacity is designed for a certain population. When you increase that population by 25%, there is no infrastructure that can really handle that. So Jordan has an enormous economic problem between the short term to medium term to really, I think, absorb those Syrians and make sure that their lives are comfortable.
Basma, always nice to get your analysis. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.